Hi everyone, this is part 1 of the lecture to accompany chapter 6 in your textbook. Please read chapter 6. There's lots of information I don't have time to discuss. Okay, let's talk about relevance fallacies. Now that you have an understanding of deductive and inductive arguments, let's talk about how we generally screw them up. Well, not always, but lots of the arguments you hear on a daily basis have some kind of mistake in them, sometimes more than one. Mistakes in reasoning are called fallacies, and the end result of a fallacy is that the argument doesn't either support or prove its conclusion. There are so many different kinds of fallacies that we could probably spend an entire semester on them, but we don't have that kind of time, so we're going to focus on the most common ones. Once you understand how easy it is to mess up an argument, it'll help you to put together good arguments as well as help you to see through the bad arguments of others. Look at this argument. You tell me it's dangerous to text when I'm driving, but I have seen you doing it. Does that sound like something you might say? Does it sound right? Does it sound justified? Lots of people would say that's a perfectly good argument. After all, does one person have any business telling someone else that texting and driving is dangerous if they do it themselves? Well, guess what? This is a fallacy. This is what a fallacy looks like, but it's fallacious because its premise, I have seen you doing it, is not really relevant to whether texting and driving is dangerous. A person can know something is dangerous yet still do it. That doesn't mean the thing they're doing isn't dangerous. This is an example of a relevance fallacy. Even though the premise seems relevant and certainly may be persuasive, it simply isn't good evidence and doesn't support the conclusion. Another term for a relevance fallacy is red herring. Farmers used to put pickled herrings around the perimeter of their crops to confuse hunting dogs during fox hunting expeditions so their crops wouldn't get trampled by dogs and horses chasing foxes across their land. The dogs wouldn't be able to pick up the fox's scent because the smelly herring would distract them, and they would go around the crops, thus saving them. So the term red herring has come to mean a distracting irrelevancy that leads away from the conclusion. Let's look at some common relevance fallacies. You might be surprised at how often you use them and how often you're convinced by them, but it's time to stop doing that. The first group of fallacies we're going to discuss are called Argumentum ad hominem, or argument to the person. There are different types of argumentum ad hominem, but they all have one thing in common. This fallacy is a response to another person's position. In other words, someone else has taken a position on the topic, and instead of addressing that person's position, the responder attacks the person instead. So let's take another look at that texting and driving argument. You tell me it's dangerous to text when I'm driving, but I have seen you doing it. So the argument has two premises and an unstated conclusion. Premise 2 does not address the claim that texting and driving is dangerous. The person is attacking the other person by saying that they do it. And it also doesn't help us understand what the conclusion of this argument is. It could be, therefore it's not dangerous, or therefore I can do it too, or therefore I don't have to listen to you. But regardless of what you think the unstated conclusion is, it's not supported by this evidence that I have seen you do it. That doesn't support the conclusion that it's not dangerous. It doesn't support the conclusion that I can do it too, and it doesn't support the conclusion that I don't have to listen to you. Even if you were to say, yeah, but it does show that the person saying texting and driving is dangerous is a hypocrite, okay, I will grant you that. But that still doesn't address the original claim that texting and driving is dangerous. Do you see that this whole argument is irrelevant to the original claim? This person has thrown in a red herring by focusing on the first person's hypocrisy instead of addressing the issue of texting and driving. And don't tell me you haven't done this before or had it done to you, because we've all done this. But now you know it's a fallacy, and now you know why. Here's another argument using the ad hominem fallacy. According to Al Gore, global warming is the most serious threat facing us today. Folks, what a crock. Al Gore spends $20,000 each year on electricity in his Tennessee mansion. So, the issue being discussed is whether or not global warming is the most serious threat facing us today. The arguer here is using the evidence that Al Gore has a really high electricity bill to come to the conclusion that global warming is not the most serious threat facing us today. Here are some assertions or claims about global warming. Let's look at them. Global warming will cause rising sea levels to swamp East Coast cities by 2100. Global warming will cause coral reefs to die within 30 years. CO2 levels have risen over 30% in the last 25 years due to global warming. According to a study published in Nature, current rates of global warming will lead to the extinction of 1 million species by 2050. Al Gore spends $20,000 each year on electricity. Now, of all of these assertions, which one is pretty much irrelevant with respect to whether global warming is a big problem or not? Yes, it's that one. An argument ad hominem actually comes in several varieties. There is the abusive ad hominem, the circumstantial ad hominem, the inconsistency ad hominem, poisoning the well, guilt by association, and the genetic fallacy. Let's look at examples of each of these. Here's an argument. What Governor Brown says about air pollution is a joke. That clown will say anything to get attention. In this argument, I'm not positive, but it looks like the issue being discussed is air pollution. It seems that the argument is, Governor Brown is a clown who will say anything to get attention. Therefore, what he said about air pollution is wrong. The person is attacking Governor Brown and using that as evidence that the claim the governor is making is wrong. Circumstantial ad hominem occurs when someone attacks a claim by saying that the person making the claim is only making it because it's in his or her interest or because of his or her circumstances. Here's an example. What Al Gore says about global warming is pure bull. Al Gore makes a fortune from alternative energy investments. What do you think he'd say? So this person is arguing that because Al Gore profits from alternative energy investments, global warming is not a serious problem. Now, whether or not Al Gore is making a profit off of his investments, that does not address the issue of global warming. It doesn't prove that global warming isn't a serious problem. Again, deflection from the actual issue. Okay, this is kind of an old example, but it's a good one to illustrate inconsistency ad hominem. In this fallacy, the arguer is saying that because Clinton initially voted for the Iraqi war, then her assertion that the U.S. should get out of the war is incorrect. Politicians are often called flip-floppers when they change their stance on something. But who doesn't change their mind sometimes, especially when new information comes to light? Regardless, just because someone changed their stance about something is not evidence that their assertion is wrong. Again, it's an attack on the person's character, not on their argument. What makes the inconsistency ad hominem so effective is that being inconsistent is under many circumstances a bad thing, especially if you're consistently inconsistent. However, the badness of the inconsistency does not automatically translate into the badness of the claim. Just because the person is saying something that goes against what they said previously, that doesn't mean that what the person is saying now is false. Poisoning the well is when you use an ad hominem argument before the person actually presents their claims, kind of like a preemptive strike. They try to get listeners to dismiss what a person is going to say by talking about the person's character, consistency, or circumstances, or in this case, questioning the speaker's motive. Senator Cortez is going to give a talk tonight on the DACA program. Well, it's just gonna be more baloney. That gal will say anything to get a vote. So the argument is that whatever the senator is saying is only so she'll get votes, which obviously has nothing to do with the DACA program. Guilt by association is a fallacy that says if a person has a quality or characteristic that is shared with another person or group that the arguer finds to be negative, then that person and their ideas are also painted as negative, as in this argument. Sarah thinks that churches should be taxed, But she's an atheist. Stalin was an atheist and he killed millions. She needs to keep her opinion to herself. Sarah is guilty by virtue of the one thing she has in common with Stalin, that they're both atheists. The fact that Sarah is an atheist really doesn't support the conclusion this person is drawing, that churches shouldn't be taxed. The genetic fallacy occurs when someone argues that the origin of a contention in and of itself automatically renders the contention either true or false. Genetic is based on the genesis of the claim, where it came from. It's a fallacy because the only evidence for the claim is who said it. Here are two different arguments about the same topic that both commit the genetic fallacy. Does God exist? Of course not. That idea originated with a bunch of ignorant people who knew nothing about science. So this claim is rejected because of where and by whom the arguer says it originated. Does God exist? Of course. My parents have been telling me this since I was small and they've never led me astray. Again, this person accepts the claim because it came from someone they trusted. In neither case is any actual evidence or support presented. We've talked about all the different iterations of the ad hominem fallacy. The second type of relevance fallacy is strawman. Ad hominem arguments try to dismiss a contention by focusing on some quality or characteristic of the opponent. By contrast, a strawman fallacy attempts to dismiss a contention by distorting the contention, by turning it into a straw man, which is something that's easy to knock over, and basically ridiculing it. Here's an example. You think it's okay to legalize marijuana, so then we'd have everyone walking around stoned all the time? I think that's ridiculous. So everyone walking around stoned all the time is a distortion and misrepresentation of what would actually happen if marijuana were legalized. The next kind of relevance fallacy we'll look at is the false dilemma fallacy. The false dilemma fallacy has lots of names. It's also known as the either-or fallacy, false choice fallacy, black-white fallacy, and false alternative fallacy. A false dilemma fallacy occurs when someone tries to establish a conclusion by offering it as the only alternative to something that we find unacceptable, unattainable, or implausible, while ignoring any other alternative solutions. In this first example, either we allow the oil companies to drill for oil in the Gulf, or we will be at the mercy of OPEC. Therefore, we shouldn't prevent the oil companies from drilling for oil in the Gulf. The arguer wants us to believe that these two options are the only ones that exist. But there are plenty of things that the U.S. can do to reduce our dependence on OPEC. Saving fuel, getting oil from other sources, and using alternative energy sources are all options. But this person doesn't want you to even think about them, so they don't mention them. The next example, either we eliminate Social Security or the country will go bankrupt. Seems like a simple choice to me. This person is saying that these are the only two choices, but of course that's not the case. There are plenty of other things that could be cut, but of course this person doesn't want those things to be cut, like probably military spending, so of course they don't mention that. The retirement age could be raised, or more people could pay into the system. In both of these examples, not laying out all the options is an attempt to distract from solutions the arguer doesn't even want you to consider. There are a few variations of the false dilemma fallacy. This one, the perfectionist version, says that we have to choose between all or nothing. You have to know at least one perfectionist. They're the person who thinks if they can't do it perfectly, they won't do it at all. This is the same thing. Here's an example. It's impossible to eliminate terrorism entirely. We should stop wasting money on it. So the argument is basically, if we can't entirely eliminate terrorism, we shouldn't even try. Obviously, even if that's true, there are other alternatives besides doing nothing. The line-drawing version of the false dilemma fallacy is an interesting variation. The arguer says that if there isn't a clear-cut line between two things, that the line doesn't exist at all and there's no difference between those two things. In this example, there shouldn't be restrictions on violence in the movies. After all, when is a movie too violent? You can't draw a line. It's saying that because there's not a specific line between no violence, some violence, and too much violence in a movie, there should be no restrictions placed on violence in movies at all. But since there are obvious examples of movies with no violence, some violence, and way too much violence, even though the line may be imprecise, it is still there. Let's move on to fallacies that involve misplacing the burden of proof. This fallacy occurs when someone tries to prove their position by trying to make someone else disprove that position. Here's the problem with this. When someone makes a claim, it's on them to provide evidence to support that claim. If their only support of the claim is that other people can't prove it to be false, that's not evidence. So in this example, I believe our former president's birth certificate was a forgery. Can you prove it isn't? This person is not putting forward any proof, just asking the person they're arguing with to prove that it's not a forgery. This is designed to distract from the fact that they probably don't have any proof, just an assertion that they believe to be true. It also puts the other person on the defensive as they have to try to come up with a response that they didn't even know they were going to have to come up with in the first place. The appeal to ignorance is an extension of misplacing the burden of proof. This fallacy occurs when the person making a claim says we should believe it because nobody has proved it to be false. So this first argument, scientists haven't been able to prove that UFOs haven't visited Earth, so there's every reason to believe they've been here. It erroneously claims that because there's no evidence that aliens haven't visited us, that they must have visited us. You can actually argue the exact opposite of this, and it would still be an appeal to ignorance. Scientists haven't been able to prove that UFOs have visited Earth, so there's every reason to believe that they haven't been here. The truth is that there isn't enough evidence to prove either of these things to be the case, actually. This second example is from the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s, in which Senator Joseph McCarthy played on American spheres of communism. When asked about certain people he claimed were communists working for the Department of State, he responded, and I quote, "I do not have much information on this person, except the general statement of the agency that there is nothing in the files to disprove his communist connections." So McCarthy as much as admitted that there was nothing in the files, but his addition of "to disprove his communist connections" convinced his followers that this absence of evidence was proof that the person in question was a communist. This example illustrates how important it is not to be taken in by this fallacy. Senator McCarthy was never able to show any evidence that these people he accused were guilty of anything, yet his witch hunt ruined many innocent lives. Our next fallacy of relevance is known as begging the question. Begging the question fallacy occurs when a person tries to support their conclusion by offering the conclusion as evidence. Basically, what they do is simply restate or repackage the conclusion. If it's done skillfully, you might not even realize you haven't actually been given any evidence. However, here are a couple of not great arguments that you might have heard. The first one is very popular in church. That God exists is proved by Scripture, because the Scriptures are the Word of God. So the argument is basically that God exists because He exists. Look, here's a book. It says that it was written by God, therefore God. The second one, the news is fake because so much of the news is fake, came from the mouth of President Donald Trump when asked why he thought the news was fake. I don't think it needs any more explanation than that. The last one is pretty much the same. Paranormal phenomena exist because I have had experiences that can only be described as paranormal. It's basically paranormal phenomena exist because I think they exist, so they do. Not very good evidence. This is the end of part 1. Let's find out about more fallacies of relevance in part 2.